This is the online lesson guide for Chapter 2 in the course Intro to Politics. All right, so first let's talk a little bit about the history of political thought. The modern democratic systems of the world do have some influence from the ancient Greeks, Plato, and Aristotle, for example. Plato being somewhat critical of democracy, but still looking at people as a whole, more important than the individual as far as having a peaceful society. Aristotle, ruled by many, better than ruled by one. St. Augustine started to look at government as a necessary evil, so to speak. As we get into the Dark Ages, the reason why they're called the Dark Ages is because not a whole lot of intellectual philosophy escaped from that era. It was very much theologically and doctrinal driven for several centuries. And during this period, the general idea is that if we're ruled by God, there's little obligation to earthly rulers. Now that starts to change, lighten up. St. Thomas Aquinas, also a Christian-based writer, starts talking about rulers are for our physical well-being, while the church is for the spiritual well-being. So we start to see a little bit of separation of church and state there. Now, Machiavelli is famous for his landmark work called The Prince, where it's almost kind of like a guidebook for a successful ruler who is virtually powerful, ruthless, pragmatic, and even today serves somewhat as a kind of the foundation for the realist perspective of politics, which we'll get into later on. Thomas Hobbes, we've already mentioned to him, he was writing about the time that the modern state that we're going to be talking about in the next chapter, he was writing his philosophy about the same time as the state was coming into being, and he made the astute observation that humans, as selfish creatures, we may have to sacrifice some of our freedom to be protected by this new entity called the state, which will dominate them in some way for a common good. And this is very prescient thinking, because this is kind of the system that we have today, that we do sacrifice a little bit of our freedom to have the safety and benefits of what an organized state can do for us. Obviously not perfect, and some states much more developed than others. We'll talk about that later on as well. Now, I've mentioned the concept of liberalism in the previous chapter, and John Locke, the philosopher, writing 1680s thereabouts, about the same time that the Parliament in England started to come into control as far as political control in England, John Locke was formalizing his philosophy of liberalism, upon which the United States government is based. The basic points to remember for the concept of liberalism is that we're stressing the individual right to freedom and property. Property, of course, is a very important thing in modern society. Owning property, you have the right to do that. And lots of laws and restrictions with respect to property. We have a lot of civil liberties and civil rights that gives us certain freedoms in a modern democratic society. And these were first articulated in Locke's philosophy, because at that time, for the most part, everybody was ruled by powerful individuals, kings, emperors, things like that. This may seem obvious, but the rule of law is the foundation for our system of government, not a human being's power. Regardless of who's in power, whoever wins the next election, we all abide and respect the rule of law. Pretty much the foundation of that is our Constitution, which we'll talk about more in detail later. The concept of trusteeship in general means voting. We're giving the power to government as long as it does what it's supposed to do. We are appointing people. We are delegating people to run our system. However, we have the right to remove them if they're not doing what we want them to do, or if they're not doing it adequately, or whatever reason that we might think that they're not being an adequate leader. And technically today, this means that we vote for somebody else and remove them from office. The concept of limited government means that we don't want a government that's too powerful. And like I said, our U.S. Constitution is based on this concept of liberalism, because when the framers of our Constitution got together to try to put this document in place, they realized that they needed a stronger central government, but they also realized that we shouldn't have a government that's too powerful. We have to maintain this concept of limited government, and still very strong concept of the American system today, that we don't want government to get too strong, too big, too powerful. It's a constant struggle to keep check on government growth. We'll talk about that more later too. Now we're going to be spending an entire 2 chapters on democracy. Democracy is a very broad concept that means rule by the people. And I just want to touch on it here because it's obviously one of the most coveted forms of governance in the world today. Not everybody is a democracy, but there seems to be a lot of interest in societies to have democratic systems, and it actually results in rebellions that turn out to be very destructive conflicts because of people wanting to change their government into a more democratic form. Now, the French philosopher Rousseau was talking about a concept of a direct democracy, which is where every individual has equal vote on policy. And this is an interesting concept that we'll get into more later, because there's really no such thing as a direct democracy in the world. The United States is not a direct democracy. Rousseau was talking about this fairly esoteric concept of a general will that represents a collective intelligence of the people. And that, of course, then translates into governance. That, of course, is very hard to do when you've got so many different people with so many different viewpoints. And to expect the representatives to be an extension of that natural disposition may be asking a little bit too much, because even these representatives have their own ideas and their own motives. So direct democracy is more of a concept that doesn't exist out there in the world, as opposed to a representative republic, which is what most democratic systems are. Based on our U.S. Constitution, we have a representative republic where we elect representatives to go to the House, to go to the Senate, to go to the President's office, and then therefore we have delegated them to represent us to create policy that's beneficial for everyone. And our representative republic is based on a stronger central government, because at the time the Constitution was written, the original 13 states were independent of each other, so to speak. They were giving themselves sovereign power, and they were about to split apart. So we had to have a stronger central government to keep them together. But we also used Locke's concept of liberalism to provide that checks and balances on power, separation of powers, the delegation of powers, the limited government, and those things. Now let's talk just briefly about the political divide in the United States. When we talk politics, or when students come into my classes, they typically think, oh, it's all about Republicans versus Democrats and they can never get along and it's just a big mess. And unfortunately, that's just the surface of it. But we do have some definite ideological divides between the conservative branch of politics and the liberal branch of politics. Now, this liberal branch of politics is separate from the concept of liberalism. This is why it gets confusing. We'll talk about how that came about in a minute. But the conservative branch of politics is typically represented by the Republican Party. We have a two-party system in the United States, and the Republican Party is considered the more conservative-leaning branch of government that talks about maintaining traditional values, talks about free market principles and less government intervention. And as on the other end of the spectrum, our liberal branch of politics in America is typically through the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party tends to lean towards liberal values, where in this case we're talking about a more acceptance of shifting norms in society, a little bit more willing to embrace change, whereas a conservative person is actually more resistant to change. The Liberal Party tends to be a little bit more aware of inequality, or the fact that we have a lot of inequality. And the liberal branch of the politics in America tends to think of government as being a little bit more proactive, taking the lead and trying to solve the problem, as opposed to the conservative side of politics that says government should be less involved and let the people, let society, or let the market solve these problems without government intervention. So those are the basic divisions between the conservative and the liberal branches of politics in America. So how did that evolve? Because both of course, now here's the symbol for the Republican Party, the elephant, and there's the symbol for the Democratic Party, the donkey. So let's just talk a few minutes as to how this divide came about, because both parties are based on the concept of liberalism. But let's talk about how the liberal branch, which now is kind of represented by the Democratic Party today. Now we start to see John Stuart Mill becoming one of the primary political philosophers that starts to talk about more progressive ideas. And he was probably influenced a little bit by the utopian socialists, and quite a bit by his father and other people who were very much looking at this utilitarianism concept, where we're trying to find the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. But John Stuart Mill was a little bit ahead of his time, putting an emphasis on education and how that should be provided, universal suffrage, which means everybody votes, and then women's rights. Clearly well ahead of his time on there for women's rights. He thought women should vote too and should be active political participants and actual getting education just like men. So pretty much ahead of his time. And so as you can see, that's progressive thinking, and that's where we start to get the divide between the more traditional conservative thinking and the progressive thinking. Now, the Industrial Revolution starts to spread the divide of inequality in the world, and we started to see, as we'll talk about Karl Marx here in a minute, who is very critical of the capitalist system. But the progressive side of politics, and this is what we start to see the progressive movement here in the late 1800s during the Industrial Revolution, we start to see a little bit more support for the working class, for protections against the effects of the wealthy owners that are I guess you could say, some of the major drivers of the Industrial Revolution, which of course, very prosperous time, very technologically driven, incredible advances in our society, more than any other time during human history, as far as the advances that were made during the Industrial Revolution. But as a part of that, we also see growing inequality, growing separation of wealth. So therefore, this side of the political spectrum, the progressive side, starts to look at how can we make this a little bit more equal, a little bit more beneficial for the working class that aren't seeing the same share of benefits that the wealthy owners are. Now, by the time we get into the 20s and the 30s, particularly during the rise of the New Deal legislation, we start to see the term shifts from progressive to liberal, and that's where that term comes from as far as a label for the Democratic Party being liberal leaning in their ideology. Now, the Depression also served to divide the government politics between Democrat and Republican, because the Depression was so devastating to our economy that the New Deal legislation during Franklin Roosevelt's terms began to increase government intervention in order to try to solve problems from the Depression. And even though some of these government policies did show very positive results, there was also kind of a resistance for an expanding government, a more intrusive government, a growing government. And so you could say that the conservative branch really kind of solidified in their opposition to increased government intervention during this period. Now, the conservative branch has its roots all the way back to Edmund Burke's writings on the French Revolution, which occurred just a few years after we wrote our Constitution. Our Constitution was actually written to try to avoid what happened in the French Revolution, where the working class, so to speak, overthrew the aristocracy. And it may have been a very invigorating time for revolution and shifting of ideas and things like that. Burke's reaction to that was that it was fairly destructive, and you can't necessarily just overthrow ideas that have been in place for centuries. In Burke's views, that's very dangerous to just totally overthrow something that's been in place for decades, if not centuries. And so upholding traditional authoritarian values kind of has its roots all the way back there. And then we start to see, since Mill was quite progressive, we start to see a divergence from Mill's views, and the conservative side of politics starts to lock in a little bit harder in their preference for common values, traditional values, family values, religious values. And so therefore we start to see the divide between conservative and progressive start to grow. And of course, the conservative side of government was very much opposed to socialism, and therefore the conservative side started to have more support of the business class, the corporate class, and the wealthy class, so to speak. So there, towards the end of the Industrial Revolution, we start to see that divide where the Republican tends to lean towards the business and corporate sector, whereas the Democrat tends to lean towards the working sector, that sort of thing. And then, of course, the opposition to the New Deal policies widened that divide even more, despite some of the successes that the New Deal, there were some failures as well, but it was a very, very trying time dealing with the Depression. And regardless of the success or the failure of the New Deal's legislations, there was growing opposition to the government getting so involved in the economy that the philosophy of less government intervention became even stronger. and it really kind of made a full comeback by the 1980s with the Reagan era politics that really said, okay, now's the time to start getting back to less government involvement. Now let's just talk for a few minutes here about some alternative systems. Socialism, it's defined as the collective or state control of production, distribution, and exchange. And so it's typically the state or the government that has this collective control. And what we do see today is some hybrid systems where you have a market system, but yet more state control of how the production and distribution is going to be managed. So there are some hybrid systems out there in the world today. Even the United States has shifted a little bit more towards some social democratic policies and still being very capitalist. So it's still evolving as we speak. Now, in the early 1800s, we had what were called the utopian socialists that had some pretty important, influential economic thinkers that were trying to look at how this industrialist capitalist society can be a little bit more equal. So there was a lot of ideas going around there, but the person that really got most of the credit for criticizing capitalism, of course, was Karl Marx. He talks quite a bit about the problems of capitalism, which are still relevant today. But however, Marx was looking at a transition from capitalism to a communist system, which was literally no governance at all, and that everybody collectively owned the goods and services of society. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But Karl Marx, very influential on his critique of capitalism and inspiring socialist systems and communist systems, even though he was a little bit vague on how to enact these alternative systems successfully. And so that left a lot of room for interpretation. And as we see, as we get into the 20th century, two systems based on socialism emerged as polar opposites of each other and ultimately failed. Both of these systems showed some successes at first, but then emerged into systems that ultimately failed. However, the concept of socialism is still alive and well today, as you may have noticed, whereas Bernie Sanders, who claims to be a socialist, even though he had to run as a member of the Democratic Party, we do see some renewed interest in socialist ideas in order to try to solve some of the problems that we have with our economy that we can get into later on. Now, communism was the ultimate goal of Karl Marx, where you have a classless society where the means of production belongs to the community. Now, this has turned out to be somewhat of a utopian concept that has never succeeded. There's never been a successful attempt at communism yet, and it's been discredited by what literally has to happen in politics and as well as human nature. Even though for everyone to be equal, that sounds enticing, as far as human nature goes, it's very difficult for everybody to buy in to the concept of everybody being equal when everybody has different ambitions, different talents, different desires. Somebody who feels like he works harder than another guy will complain that why is that guy getting the same as me even though I work twice as hard as he does. So there's lots of problems with effectively operating a communist system in practice. Now, one of the things that Marx predicted was that an overthrow of capitalism would occur. It has not occurred. Capitalism, as a matter of fact, been very flexible and very adaptable in its ability to revitalize itself. In addition, capitalism has been extremely successful despite its problems, despite the fact that there's a lot of inequality that's a potential byproduct of capitalism. but we do know capitalism is just by its very nature conforms more readily and more flexibly to human behavior. And that's one of the reasons why capitalism has sustained and maintained and still, in general, been fairly successful. I talked about the Stalinist version of socialism, to where he sought to have massive industrialization and collectivism, and it turned out to be a very authoritative system where a lot of deaths occurred. That version, although it might have shown some productive gains early on, was unsustainable and eventually collapsed. And what we see with communism in general is that even though it's got this utopian element that's somewhat appealing, that everybody's equal, you still have to have somebody who's in charge, somebody that plans what's going to get done, and somebody who has authority over doling out the resources. And so what we see turns into a single party authoritarian system with very little freedoms, or much less freedoms than you would have in a democratic system. Plus, it's very conducive to corruption, because you have somebody who has assumed control and then ultimately assumes total control. Fascism is another form of a system that occurred particularly in Nazi Germany, where it's less of a political ideology than it is a popular nationalist movement based on a mythical war-based society of the past. Particularly under the rule of Hitler, the idea was self-sufficient productionism and interventionism. So you could sarcastically say that rather than trade with another country, well, what the heck? We'll just invade you and dominate you, and then just take over your products, instead of trading with you. And so you have the potential here for charismatic authority, which is what I talked about last chapter, and eventual total authority of the state, particularly under Hitler's reign, which of course is one of the most disastrous regimes in the history of mankind. So for the quiz preparation, got a few things you can focus on, but for this chapter, what are the primary principles of liberalism upon which our U.S. government is based? We talked about a few major concepts of liberalism. And then what are a couple of the factors that led to this political divide in the U.S. between the conservative and the liberal branches of government, or what we would call the Republican Party or the Democratic Party? And then some terms to define socialism, communism, fascism. All right, so that concludes the lesson guide for Chapter 2.